Sometimes English makes sense.
And sometimes it doesn't.
If you really want to confuse your English teacher, ask them about collocations.
Let's get to it.
You can ask your English teacher, why do we choose the collocations that we do? Why do they go together? What is the purpose? This gets hard. Sometimes it's language logic. Sometimes it's because it sounds better. Sometimes it's because it sounds like something else.
When I was younger, I studied Spanish. And in my Spanish class, I often asked the question, why? Why do you do this in Spanish versus this in Spanish? Why don't you do that in Spanish? The answer I always got was that somebody, somewhere, decided that it was going to be like that.
And that sometimes that's what languages do. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
So why is this important?
Because they're super hard to learn. These collocations, or these pairing of words that seem almost fixed, are kind of a shared cultural knowledge across American speakers.
Yeah, because there might be different collocations in different English-speaking countries, because they're somewhat culturally defined. Sometimes they're linguistically defined. You don't really know, which makes them hard to pinpoint and find. So today we're going to talk about some why and how they are formed, broadly speaking. And just so you know, phrasal verbs are a type of collocation.
So instead of just giving you fish of just here's 1,000 collocations to try to remember, what we're going to do is to try to analyze some reasons why we actually do this and how we actually do this, so that in the future you can have a name for these pairing of words.
Even if you don't remember the names, at least you can understand that there is a little bit of logic. You can understand how something came to be in case your English teacher is completely stumped and they have no idea.
Yeah, so you don't get the answer that I got, which is because. So the first way these collocations are formed is because of an alliteration or a rhyme.
Yes, so an alliteration is when the first sound of 2 or 3 words is the same sound. So for example, above average, or crystal clear,
or familiar face,
or murder mystery.
All these words sound similar at the beginning. They sound the same. And so when we say them, there's something that happens in an English speaker's ears when you say murder mystery. The sounds that we hear are very pleasing to hear. Murder mystery, familiar face, crystal clear.
These are something that you will hear professional speakers use, or commercials or advertising to use. Many brands use this in their slogans or in their business names. I feel like this is the majority of the reason why a lot of superhero names in American culture are things with an alliteration, like Peter Parker or Clark Kent. They're easy to remember, they roll off the tongue in a way, and it makes them powerful. So look for alliterations in English, learn how to use them to sound more pleasing to an English speaker's ears. Now, I will say don't overdo it. Don't do a ton of it, because then it's just cheesy.
So the second way to form a collocation is when you pair 2 synonyms together, or things that have similar meanings.
So you have things like close together.
Wait, that's the same thing.
Almost. A lot of these have a semantic range that overlaps. So they share maybe 1 or 2 meanings, but they have other meanings on the outside. So it's kind of almost like an emphasizer. It sounds good to say close together or time period, but it's not necessary. Time and period mean the same thing in several instances, but they also have a slightly different meaning on the fringes of their semantic range. So if you are using a tool like Grammarly, they'll actually tell you to take these out or simplify them to 1 word. Don't do it too much though, because time period sounds far more pleasing than period or time.
There are some tricky ones with this too, because like she's talking about with those range of meanings, sometimes they just barely overcross, but this is enough for an English speaker to know that these are synonyms. So for example, a dead body. We would say, dead means that something is dead, but body could mean like my body. But oftentimes when a person comes to a crime scene, comes to a person, they will call that a body. The body is there, not a person is there, because that person is dead and gone, which is another collocation. So we would call that a body. So a dead body in this instance are synonyms.
Yeah, it could be very precise, right? Are you talking about warm bodies or dead bodies? But the meaning here can be both. It can be both. So some of these are kind of like splitting hairs a little bit, but We're just trying to help you get some more memory hooks so that you can understand some of these phrases.
So a couple more of these are things like bare necessities or common knowledge, fair deal, healthy diet.
Common sense is another one. These are things that we always say that way. We don't think of them as having the same meaning necessarily, but if you really sat down and you looked at all the definitions to each of the words in these phrases, you're going to see that there's a common definition between the two.
The third way to form a collocation are antonyms.
Antonyms are when two meanings are opposing, they're opposite meanings.
These are strange because they're purposefully opposing. So, for example, the word deafening silence.
Sometimes it's going for high contrast, like black and white, or directly opposite. But this is also one of our favorite ways to describe people because it gives a kind of depth that doesn't exist when you just give flat adjectives, meaning different parts of somebody's personality. So creative authors will definitely use these to describe people or places or feelings. And there's some kind of depth and beauty that comes with this when we are writing. So for example, what Josh said before, deafening silence. It doesn't logically make sense, but English speakers can pick this up and be like, that's actually a really clever thing to say.
Yeah.
Sometimes silence is overwhelming. And that's what this means. It's so quiet, it's overwhelming.
So a few others are things like honest mistake or an educational game even. Normally people think of games as very fun oriented, but if you say educational game, in our minds it kind of sets up for, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. Education, it's boring, but then game, and then it like drops it and you're like, whoa, that was pretty clever. So the fourth way to form a collocation is to create a word picture or use verbal imagery in your speech.
So this is something like ice cold or junk mail.
Or level the playing field or running late.
These are things that give us pictures in our minds. So again, it creates more beauty in English to use things like this, but it also has a feeling attached to it. Something that feels ice cold. It's like as cold as ice. It creates a picture in our mind or a feeling. It evokes some kind of feeling.
And you're able to wrap your mind around it, where you're making a metaphor so that people have other things to attach to the meaning that you're trying to say.
Right. It seems like some of these actually become like compound nouns. So like fire truck, for example.
The sixth way to form a collocation is to supply a necessary verb or object.
So you know phrasal verbs. They're also under the collocation umbrella because they're two verbs we use together all the time. Well, in this case, you have like a verb and an object that comes together, like a verb and a noun. This can be something like wage a war or cast a vote or to drive somebody crazy.
When you think about it, you have these nouns, you have these ideas in English, and if we don't have any verb that goes with it, then we have to use really common verbs like do, get, have, meet, make, take. These are very directional oriented verbs, but they often get overused. So if you say, I make a war,
or
you
I
can
make
say,
a wage, or I make mischief.
right, this is okay, but it would be better if we could have more creative, if we can have other verbs that we can use instead of saying make 100 times.
Right. So these are one of the things that you can use to sound more informally friendly. You can use them to sound more informally fluent. But it's also something you need to pay attention to if you are seeking mastery. These are going to be one of the things that you have to pull back a little bit because this is something that even American writers or other English-speaking writers have to do in order to become better at writing, to sound a little less monotonous, a little less watered down. You would to elevate the words that you use. But for informal speaking, in writing, and in business writing even, these are actually really common to use and important to know. So we have included a list of these, of 137 of these, in the description below. You click on the link, put in your email, and we'll send them right to you because these are tricky.
Yeah, and like she said, they kind of level up your game. You can kind of start using these in your writing, and people are going to immediately know that you have actually studied English because there's more creative means to say something instead of just do the thing.
Yeah, these are really nifty to have in your back pocket.
The final one that we're going to talk about is to add emphasizers to the end of a description.
Yes, so these are also a great sign to me that somebody has really invested time into English because these phrases seem meaningless from an ESL standpoint, from a direct translation standpoint, but they're really, really nifty. They make you sound a lot more fluent.
They're often used with adjectives as a kind of form of measurement of frequency or how something is done. For example, it's absolutely necessary.
You could say firmly established or fail miserably.
Or badly damaged.
I fully understand something, or it is highly unlikely. Like, these are some great collocations and descriptors to communicate meaning, but this is something else in writing you have to be careful about that doesn't water down your writing. There's a degree that you can use them in, but there's also a degree where you need to pull back if you're trying to go for mastery. But again, if you are working to be a fluent English speaker, this is something that you should be working on building up, not something you should avoid doing.
So the last way to form a collocation is to use something that is incredibly difficult to say, which are irreversible binomials, which is a really fancy word to say that we like to have two words together and they have to be in this order. This first, then this.
These are things like cat and dog, salt and pepper, give and take. These are words that we just put together in the same order every time. It's something that is one of those things that you can put on a flashcard and remember because we always say it that way. There are times where an author or a speaker will intentionally switch them in order to make their audience feel a little uncomfortable or be like, do a double take and say, wait, what? That's not how we do it. It's not like we won't understand you if you say pepper and salt or take and give, but it's going to feel strange. It's going to be like grating on a cheese grater or something. It's going to be very strange.
Yeah, it's going to be petting the cat's hair in the opposite direction.
Yeah, kind of has that feeling. For sure. These are one of the things that you can learn in set phrases. We're going to do a whole video just on these and give you guys a resource for that as well in the near future. So don't worry, we have you covered.
So the next part is to just answer the question, why do we do it? And we've already talked about that it gives an emphasizer and it gives a necessary verb or object.
Sometimes it just sounds good.
Another reason why we do this, though, is because it offers clarification. Sometimes there is a noun and there are two ways that this shows up. And so when you use a collocation, when you use this combined with this noun, then you're giving more information than just creating a new word for that. So for example, a nonstop flight. I've personally never been on an airplane where they had to stop somewhere just to refuel so we can continue on our journey. But that used to be a thing that happened. And so now we have the collocation nonstop flight to give some sort of clarification. Fifth reason why we do this is to show formality. So sometimes we use these collocations to show the other person verbally with our words that the context that we're speaking in is more formal or less formal.
Usually less formal.
Another reason why we can sometimes use collocations is it can make something shorter. So to describe this idea could take longer if we use just descriptive language, if we're just trying to describe it to a person. But you have things like laugh out loud, which has even been shortened more to LOL, or missing in action, MIA. If we tried to explain that idea, that there was a soldier and he was taken or missing, it would be many more words than just to say the soldier went MIA.
Another way that we use collocations is to make it creative or more impactful. And this is what I was referring to before with public speakers often use this and marketing messages often use these collocations because it just sounds better. It resonates with us inside. It resonates with us mentally because it's something that's more comfortable in a way. Even if it means something different, it has a hook into the way we grew up. It has a hook into our feeling as Americans.
The last reason why we do this is they're used sometimes as an euphemism. So for example, we use the collocation put on weight. That is another way to say get fat, or a person has gotten fat. But we say put on weight because we use this collocation because it is a nicer way to say the same idea.
It could also mean, though, to intentionally build muscle. So it just depends on the context in which you're using it. Be very clear with that one, though, so you don't offend anybody. Another one is something like deliver a baby. So to deliver a baby is a much nicer way to say than to birth a baby. It seems a little harsh, so especially birth. So deliver sounds much nicer to English ears. So deliver a baby is much kinder and gentler term to use.
It almost seems happy.
almost
hey,
happy.
she delivered the baby. And it's like, oh, that's nice.
That's much nicer than birth.
It's like
I don't know.
It's like getting a package in the mail.
The way words feel is also different person to person and culture to culture, city culture to city culture. It's like, really, there's going to be a lot of different opinions on this. But in terms of how I grew up and the way that I feel about it, what about you? Birth is kind of like a rough word to use. It's not wrong. It's not like it evokes like terrible feelings for me. It's just like linguistically or just phonetically, it sounds more harsh than deliver.
So if you are an astute learner in English, then you will see that there is actually words and phrases that use a lot of these elements combined all together, which make them far more impactful than just if they were separated on their own. So for example, the idea of crystal clear is an alliteration, crystal clear, and also it is picturesque, the image of a crystal.
Yeah. And sometimes these things overlap, like making mischief. It involves a necessary verb, but it also is an alliteration. So don't memorize these categories. That's not what we want you to do. We've broken them up into these categories for you to just kind of have some ways to think about these words and ways to spot them. Because until you start listening and reading to a lot of English, you're really not going to pick it up. So don't memorize the categories. We have put these in here so that you can have some memory hooks so that you can hopefully recognize them. But the best way to find these or to learn them is to catch them. Read a lot of English, listen to a lot of English, and words that you notice are always put together. That's probably a collocation, so note those. Make sure you have some kind of list or book that has a collection of these words or phrases that always appear together or in a certain order. And before long, you'll basically learn more fluent English by just getting an ear for the language.
Yeah, that's really how we as native English speakers acquire these collocations, as we read them in a book or we hear them from somebody else, and then they kind of almost spread through the American population to be like, oh yeah, above average. I always say above average. Why do I say above average? Because it sounds nice and we've heard it, we've taken it in, and now we then use it.
Yeah, definitely. You can even create your own, but make sure that they make sense to an American first. Because there's some times where things are put together in maybe your own language and you directly translate into English and it doesn't quite make sense because it doesn't have any cultural relevance. So make sure it's something that is very relevant. If it's something relevant to the human existence, it will probably catch on. Sometimes that's a type of meme that comes about, something relevant to normal life. But this is something that you can use to play with the language, but also give some more depth of meaning to the language that you're speaking.
So guys, keep your eyes out and make sure that you grab the resource in the link below where we give you 137 of these, especially verbs that go with an object, because these are some ways that you can immediately show a native speaker, hey, I've actually put work into figuring out your language, and it comes with using these special verbs with these nouns or with these objects.
Yep, definitely use that and take advantage of it because that's 137 phrases closer to fluency.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope that we will catch you on the next one.
Bye.